what I want to do is to cover the two questions I was asked to deal with, the first being whether the early years are important for the rest of the life course, and the second is resilience. The early years are, of course, important, but I need to say a word as to why. And there are several rather different reasons. The first is, to state the obvious, that they come first. And that means that they're in a position to influence what happens afterwards in terms of what goes on during that period. Second, that there's abundant evidence that from long-term longitudinal studies that both social disadvantage at a community level and personal experiences of abuse or neglect have strong relationships with functioning later. The third is that basic science research has shown that the embedding of life experiences in the biology of organisms operates in a major way. Let me just explain what I mean by that. In the old days, there was a sort of assumption that you had the organism and then you had experiences, and that they got nothing to do with one another. And I hope nobody in this room believes that dichotomy, because it's not the case. So that let's look at how life experiences do get embedded. Firstly, there's epigenetics. Epigenetics is the mechanism by which chemical processes affect gene expression. That's to say, your genes you're born with, and they're with you throughout life, but they only work if they're what is called expressed, and that's where epigenetics comes in. Epigenetics is a process that involves experiences, it involves chance, and it involves genes. Thirdly, there are changes in the neuroendocrine system, the HPA axis as it's called. As we know from a lot of research, both acute stresses and chronic adversities have major effects on the neuroendocrine system. But what has become clear over the last decades is that the effects are rather different between acute stress and chronic adversities. You might think, well, why is that? Surely the adversities will just be more long-lasting versions of the same, but they're not. And the thing is that the neuroendocrine system functions, as it were, of gearing up action in relation to acute stresses. But actually that's rather bad for the organism if that goes on over time. And so that the longer term effects involve a flattening of the activation that you see with acute stresses. Now, that raises tricky problems as to what you should do in terms of intervention. But I'll come back to that in a moment. There are changes also in the telomeres. That's the end bit of chromosomes where the telomeres reflect aging processes, and that experiences influence these bits of the organism. And then also there are changes in brain growth. I mean, that may seem a rather extreme concept, but it isn't really. The work that we did with Romanian adoptees showed very clearly that there are major effects on brain growth for individuals who experience prolonged institutional care involving global adversity. It only kicks in, as it were, after about 6 months, but then having kicked in, it's very marked. But fourth, we need to appreciate that the changes are not necessarily permanent, and they may be at least partially reversible. So there's an assumption that once the biology is involved, then you've had it. Well, it isn't like that. And so we need to contemplate what aspects of the biology we can do something about. And the fifth point is that there are huge individual differences in response to experiences. That's been shown in experimental work and in naturalistic studies, and it's been shown in terms of psychosocial experiences, in terms of nutrition, in terms of toxic effects of one sort or another. And interestingly, in the Romanian study, you'd have thought that the global deprivation involving all sorts of horrible things would have wiped out individual differences, but it doesn't. The group who had been longest in the institution still showed as much variability as those who'd remained shorter periods of time. And that, of course, brings us on to the notion of resilience, and also to the notion of differential susceptibility. One of the things that came out of genetic research is showing that there are major genetic effects on vulnerability to adverse experiences. But then it got pointed out by people like Tom Boyce and Jay Belsky that that's a rather odd notion. How would evolution have worked to produce genes that are only involved with bad experiences, and may not be the case that these are genes concerned with what they've called differential susceptibility, meaning susceptibility to environments of all kinds. The research on this has still some way to go, but the evidence is growing that it is likely to be a largely valid concept. Does it matter? Well, yes, it matters hugely, because there was a while when it was shown that there were particular polymorphisms, genetic variations, associated with adverse responses to maltreatment, to acute stresses. Then the assumption was, well, this is the group you can't do anything about, so let's put them on one side and focus on the remainder. Well, the interesting...
Is it possible to put up the microphone a little bit? It's quite difficult to get back.
I can't put up the microphone, so anybody who knows how to put up the microphone can fiddle it. I'll speak louder, that's probably the easiest way. What the differential susceptibility findings suggest is that those who are most genetically vulnerable to adverse experiences are also the ones who are most susceptible to the positive effects of therapeutic interventions. So that rather than put this on one side as a sort of hopeless group, you need to think that this is actually the group that may be most important to intervene with. Now, let me say a bit more about resilience. It's a sort of buzzword. It's used widely now, and it's recognized as being a good thing. But it's important to appreciate that it refers to a dynamic process operating over time, and not, as it were, some kind of equivalent of the chemical interaction at the moment that a stress occurs. And that it's also not the same as positive experiences. It's not the same as social competence. Both of those are important concepts, but they are different. And the thing about resilience is it's referring to what happens in relation to those who do have an adverse experience of some important kind. Nevertheless, although because of that you can't teach resilience in the way that you teach mathematics or geography, because it's not a trait, it's a process. But nevertheless, it's a process that may be influenced by interaction. So you can't teach resilience as a trait. You can teach the kind of skills that are involved in making it more likely that people will be resilient. So that there's firstly the opportunities to cope with stress and adversity, and indeed with challenge generally. It used to be thought that you needed to protect people from any kind of challenge. It's a sort of ridiculous notion if you come to think about it. So that the one sure way of making it more likely that individuals will be vulnerable to infections is to protect them from exposure to any kind of infections. Immunity builds up through exposure. In terms of what one can do, that you need to bring in other things too, so that, for example, the studies that have been done of individuals who've come out of stress or adversity well have indicated the importance of self-efficacy and of a sense of agency. So Al Bandura, the American psychologist, still going strong at 90, was very important in pointing out that it's not self-esteem that you need to focus on. Feeling good about yourselves, of course, is a nice thing, but actually it's the sense that you can cope, of what he called self-efficacy, and that you need to focus on that, so that it's an active thing, not a passive thing. The sense of agency, which a whole variety of people have focused on, is the sense that you can do something about your situation. And one of the things that has come out of all the studies of stress and adversity is that people who have experienced this tend to feel there's nothing they can do about their situation. And this comes out most clearly in those who've experienced institutional care, where, of course, in order to provide for good services for individuals in care, all decisions tend to be taken away from them. And that's actually not a good thing to be doing. And that the personal accounts of people who've come through bad experiences well all emphasize that they have this sense of agency, that however bad things may be, you can do something about it. You can't, of course, do everything. Everything's not within your control. But even when things are at their worst, there are things that can be done and which make a difference. And then let me just end by coming back to the differential susceptibility concept, that the genes that make people vulnerable to adversity are also the same genes that make people susceptible to respond positively to therapeutic interventions of any kind. And the other thing, particularly after the last talk, that I need to come back to is that as well as the sense of agency, there, in terms of those who've come out of adversity successfully, a sense of social connectedness and social support has also been important. We are social animals, and I'll use the word animals advisedly. We are very dependent throughout life, not just in infancy, but in old age as well, with interactions with other people, and that we need to do what we can to make those experiences positive, and that, if you like, one of the things in terms of psychological interventions is to make unnecessary the professional involved. I mean, that sounds an odd thing. Is there not a danger we put ourselves out of business? Well, I wish that was a problem, but unfortunately that's not likely to happen. And that what one nevertheless still needs to do is the way that you deliver psychological interventions, there will be a message to the individual as to how that is done. And there is a good deal of research now to indicate that the form of that message may make a difference. And on that note, I will end. Thank you. We probably do have time for a question or two.
We have, I don't know if this works. We have a question, time for a question, yeah. So it sounds like you kind of agree, the two of you, right? That's great. Is there any questions for Mike right now? Yeah. I'll just come down with the microphone.
Sure.
One question. You were talking about, I'm Jesper Gilling, I'm a dentist. I'm working with some of these areas. You were talking about quite a lot of individual, how you cope with stress. Do you know anything about if you're measuring within different communities that those differences will have an equivalencies between the communities, or is it very local, these differences? What I'm thinking about is that maybe genetically we can see communities having certain amounts of people that will take stress on different levels, sort of to make the whole community more prone to survive to stress. Do you get the question?
Yes, I do. Well, the person who's written most on this is Michael Rutter from Canada. I'm not sure that I wholly agree with him in the sense that the measurement of resilience at a community level is really quite tricky. Clearly there are communities that show jointly a way of functioning that promotes better outcomes. I don't doubt that. But when it comes down to it, I think you still have to be concerned with it at the individual level. Now, being part of a community where there are a lot of others showing similar positive qualities certainly can be helpful. But the scientific study of resilient communities is in its infancy, I think.
My name is Wenka Simovska from Aarhus University. Thank you very much, both of you, first of all. And I've been working with resilience from a psychological and educational perspective for a long time, and I've been inspired by your work a lot. First in Macedonia with the Bosnian refugee children, where we had a psychosocial intervention, and then later on here in Denmark. My question and my struggle, actually, has been with the concept of resilience, which I later on kind of abandoned a little bit, and now I'm coming back to it and replaced it with something which we in my research environment call action competence of children and young people. So my struggle has been between this little individualistic. I know you talk about social connectedness and the importance of the environment and everything, but my doubts are similar to what you mentioned, Karsten, in relation to immunity and vaccination. The primary purpose has been economical for introducing the childhood vaccinations rather than health and well-being of children. So in terms of resilience, how much these conceptualizations kind of speak in terms of amelioration and coping, but still adaptation to adversity, rather than actively developing skills in children and young people that they could tackle the determinants, the societal determinants of adversity, which could result in their sense of agency and resilience. But there is something there between a focus on the individual and the focus on the structure, no matter how this dualism has been kind of transcended nowadays.
Okay,
Can you
well,
comment on that?
You think you're right to emphasize this duality. So there has been a danger, and in fact, in some places still a danger, of assuming human beings are resilient. You don't need to do anything. They'll get over it themselves. Well, some will, some won't. And that's where one needs to have an active coping involvement. So it's not rightly treated as something that you can just sort of forget about because it's part of the human biology. Well, it is sort of part of human biology, but to varying degrees. And we do not have a medication that can do all of that. Would we use it if we did have such a thing? Well, I hope we would. And I think that I'm involved, for example, in chairing a working party for the Academy of Medical Sciences dealing with testing the efficacy and harms associated with medication. And it arose in part because the Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, wrote expressing concern about the use of statins to treat healthy individuals to prevent them from having heart disease later. Well, I think the idea that it's wrong to treat healthy people to prevent future illness, I mean, it's an absurd notion. I mean, vaccination is the widely used version of this in relation to infectious disease. And if there was something of the same kind that you could use in relation to mental health, I hope we will use it. At the moment, we don't have such a thing, and we may never have such a thing. But the notion that it's wrong in kind to prevent later malfunction by treating individuals who are currently healthy in order to prevent them developing later problems, I don't have any sympathy with that. If we had such a thing, we should do it.
I think we should have a last comment from you, David.
Just briefly, one of the benefits that we found is skill sharing. So those people that have got through stuff and have acquired those skills can share them with their peers and with other young people. So recognizing exactly that some people get through stuff better than others, they, by sharing what it is that they've done to do that does help build community resilience and peer resilience. So creating an environment in which people can share their positive experiences of getting through things and the skills that they've used to do that. And we've had people who've, even things like hearing and seeing things, people are getting very good. Some people are very good at managing that experience, and sharing how they've managed it is immensely helpful, because it's a very, very frightening thing. When I was, when I was 14, 15 and started hearing and seeing things, nothing prepared me for that experience. And now we have a little bit of a culture where people can talk about that in advance, and those kind of non-biochemical interventions, we do have more of those now than we had when I was growing up.
Okay, I think we should say thank you to both of you.